The sound of muted voices echoed through the war room. Holographic projections of the galaxy floated before the assembled officers and politicians, flickering under the harsh fluorescent lights. A handful of ships, human ships, were scattered across the vastness of space, retreating. Their light barely flickered against the crushing tide of Varnath warships. No matter what humanity threw at the alien fleet, it wasn't enough. The Varnath had perfected their technology over centuries, while humanity was still catching up, often relying on sheer numbers rather than precision. Admiral Henriksen stood at the head of the table, his face grim. "We are outmatched," he said, his voice heavy with finality. "Their fleet is too powerful. Our weapons can't penetrate their shields. We're not going to survive this unless we have something more, something new." The room grew silent. Most of the generals had already given up hope. Some whispered about surrender, others about retreating to the outer colonies, hoping to regroup. Ilara Vasquez felt the weight of their gaze as the young engineer stepped forward, her proposal hanging in the air like an unspoken challenge. Ilara had always been the outsider. Her unconventional ideas were both feared and revered in the military and scientific circles. She was a woman who pushed limits, often without considering the consequences. And now, standing before the most influential figures of humanity, she needed them to believe in her idea. "I have a solution," she said, projecting confidence even though a seed of doubt gnawed at her. She wasn't sure if they would embrace her theory or dismiss her outright. But this was the only shot left. A weapon unlike anything we've ever conceived. A weapon powerful enough to punch through their shields. A human-powered railgun. The room erupted in disbelief. The most senior officers exchanged uncertain glances, but none dared interrupt her. Ilara could feel the tension, the weight of their scrutiny pressing down like 1,000 tons. Human-powered. General Cross' voice dripped with incredulity. "Are you suggesting we build a weapon based on human strength? That's insane. We're talking about soldiers firing energy beams with their bodies. The idea is ludicrous." Ilara didn't flinch. "Not just human strength, General. It's more than that." She turned toward the holographic display and pointed to a diagram of the human body's kinetic capabilities. "We've developed a way to use the human body as a conduit. A soldier's kinetic energy, amplified by magnetic fields and advanced technology, can launch projectiles at speeds far beyond anything we've ever seen. A human operator, conditioned to withstand the strain, would be able to fire rounds capable of breaching Varnath shields. The key is amplifying what humans are already capable of." The room fell into stunned silence once more. Some murmured under their breath. Others leaned forward, eyes narrowing with skepticism. Admiral Henriksen's brow furrowed deeply, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the cold metal table. "And how, Captain, do you plan on harnessing this amplification? What are we talking about here? Enhanced soldiers? Genetic modifications?" Ilara nodded, her expression serious. "Not modifications, but enhancements. We can train soldiers, push them beyond their limits. The technology is there. We just need the right bodies to test it. If we succeed, we can turn the tide of this war." The Admiral was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. Finally, he spoke. "We're running out of time. If this is our only option, we'll back you. But if this fails, humanity's future is over." A heavy silence fell over the room. Ilara felt the weight of his words, but she also felt something else. Hope. A flicker of it. The war was far from won, but for the first time in months, she felt like humanity might stand a chance after all. The decision had been made. The war room was abuzz with activity as military officers and engineers scrambled to set plans into motion. But for Ilara Vasquez, the real challenge had only just begun. She had the military's backing, but it came with a catch: time. There wasn't much left. The Varnath fleet was closing in, and every moment spent on research and development brought them closer to the end of humanity's reign. Ilara worked around the clock. Days bled into nights as she locked herself in her lab, surrounded by stacks of schematics, energy conversion models, and data readouts. The walls of the sterile room seemed to close in as she buried herself in the intricacies of the Railgun's design. She had the theory: human kinetic power, magnetic amplification, and projectile acceleration. But making it work, that was another story. It didn't take long before the first problem arose. The original prototype of the Railgun was designed to harness the kinetic energy of a soldier's body, transferring it into a magnetic field that would propel a metal slug at speeds beyond comprehension. But when she tried to scale the concept to something battle-ready, things went sideways. Every test resulted in catastrophic failure. The system was too unstable. The energy needed was far beyond the human body's capacity to control. Ilara didn't back down. If anything, the failures only fueled her determination. She called in a team of bioengineers to study human muscle tissue and how it could be augmented without risking the operator's life. Their suggestions were borderline radical: genetic enhancements, synthetic muscle fibers, and even neural interfaces to allow the human brain to better control the intense energy. The military brass was watching with increasing impatience. Some were still convinced Ilara's vision was nothing more than a science experiment destined to fail. But there was one man who had the final say: General Cross, a seasoned leader who had seen his fair share of impossible situations. He wasn't convinced, but he understood that desperate times required desperate measures. He gave her a chance and a deadline. "You have 4 weeks, Captain," Cross told her during one of their briefings, his voice as hard as granite. "If you can't show results by then, this project will be scrapped. I'm not going to waste resources on a fantasy." 4 weeks. Ilara stared at the holographic countdown on the wall, feeling the weight of it pressing down on her chest. She couldn't fail. Not now. Not when humanity's survival rested on the edge of this razor-thin hope. The days were a blur of sleepless nights and moments of fleeting clarity. But the breakthrough came in an unexpected form. One evening, as she was working through another round of frustrating failures, her assistant, a young scientist named Kiran, approached with a suggestion that seemed too simple to be true. "What if," Kiran said, "we stop thinking of it as a purely physical weapon and start integrating an energy absorption system into the design? What if the human operator doesn't generate the power, but harnesses it from the railgun itself?" Ilara paused, considering the idea. It was brilliant in its simplicity. Rather than relying solely on human strength, why not use the railgun to capture and convert energy from the magnetic field into usable power? The human operator would still be the catalyst, but the weapon would do the heavy lifting. That night, Ilara stayed up long after everyone else had left the lab, feverishly redesigning the system. She worked until her fingers ached, drawing new circuits and modifying the energy conversion matrix. By the time the sun began to rise, she had the first working prototype, a railgun that harnessed human energy without killing its operator. The next day, Ilara stood before her team, adrenaline coursing through her veins. "This is it," she said, her voice steady. "We've found a way. Now, we test." And test they did. The first shot from the prototype was shaky, but it worked. The projectile fired. It didn't hit the target yet, but it blasted a hole clean through the reinforced steel plate, a clear sign of the weapon's potential. The room erupted in cheers, but Ilara felt a cold sense of realization wash over her. They had done it. But this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be even harder. There was still so much that could go wrong, and the military was breathing down her neck. But for the first time, she felt the spark of hope again. Humanity had a chance. The days that followed the first success were a blur of calculations, reconfigurations, and intense anticipation. The railgun was no longer a theory. It had become a prototype. But Ilara knew that the first real test, firing the railgun in a combat scenario, would determine if humanity had a weapon capable of turning the tide of the war. There was no room for error. The countdown was ticking, and the Varnath fleet loomed ever closer. The testing facility was built deep within the Arctic region, a place isolated from the world's prying eyes. The harsh environment was perfect for their clandestine operation, far from the media and public outcry that could easily derail their progress. Inside the high-tech facility, everything was ready for the next phase. The first test shot, aimed at a Mach-Varnath ship built to mimic their advanced armor. Ilara stood before the Railgun prototype, her heart pounding. The massive weapon towered over the testing chamber, its sleek metallic frame humming with raw power. The human operator, Lieutenant Ronax Carter, had been prepped and conditioned for the task, his body enhanced with the necessary genetic augmentations to withstand the immense strain. He was a volunteer, a soldier who had sacrificed everything for this chance to save humanity. He had trained for months, enduring grueling physical exercises and simulations to prepare for the moment when he would be the one to pull the trigger. "We're good to go, Captain," Kieran said, standing next to the console. His eyes were wide with excitement, but tinged with doubt. "The systems are primed. The operator is in position." Ilara nodded, taking a deep breath. This was the moment of truth. Humanity's survival rested on the edge of this one shot. She activated the controls, and the chamber doors slid open, revealing Ronax inside the massive firing bay. He sat in the harness, connected to the Railgun's neural interface, his body linked to the weapon. He had trained for this, but Ilara knew there was no way to fully prepare for the intense energy that would surge through him. "Lieutenant Carter," she called through the comm system. "Are you ready?" His voice crackled through the speakers. "Ready, Captain." A tense silence followed as Ilara checked every readout. She could feel her pulse quicken. Everything had been calibrated, but there was no way to predict how the Railgun would perform under real conditions. Would it work as they'd hoped, or would it disintegrate Ronax's body under the strain? Firing in 3, 2, 1. Ilara's voice trembled slightly as she gave the command. The room exploded into action. A surge of magnetic energy shot through the Railgun, and the weapon fired. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The projectile launched with a deafening crack, cutting through the air at a speed that no human eye could follow. But before Ilara could even exhale, the chamber lit up with a brilliant, blinding flash. The projectile veered off course, slamming into the side wall, and sending shards of metal flying through the room. The energy wave that followed knocked Ilara off her feet, and the lights flickered out. Alarms blared. "Status report," she shouted, scrambling to her feet as the room descended into chaos. Kieran was already at the console, his face pale. "The target is destroyed." But Ronax. Ilara's heart raced. She turned to the monitoring screens, praying for good news. The test had failed spectacularly, but the results weren't a total loss. The projectile had shattered the Mach-Varnath ship, but it had also caused massive collateral damage within the chamber. Ronax's vitals flashed on the screen. He was alive, but just barely. His body had absorbed far more strain than they had anticipated, and he was unconscious, his heartbeat dangerously erratic. Ilara dashed to the medical bay, where Ronax was being rushed for immediate treatment. His body was littered with signs of trauma. Bruising, burns, and blood pooling in places where his body had been torn apart by the force of the blast. "Will he survive?" Ilara asked, her voice tight with fear. The medic didn't hesitate. "He's tough. He'll survive. But this test shows we're not there yet. The strain on his body, it's beyond human limits." Ilara's stomach churned. The weapon had worked, but it had come at a price. Ronax had nearly paid with his life. As she watched Ronax's unconscious form, a wave of guilt washed over her. The potential of the Railgun was undeniable, but it was clear now that humanity's gamble wasn't without consequences. She had promised them victory, but what price would humanity pay to achieve it? The ticking clock on the wall reminded her that there was no time for second guesses. The Varnath were coming, and they wouldn't wait for perfection. Days after Ronax's near-fatal ordeal, Ilara sat alone in her office, staring at a screen filled with data. The test had proven that the railgun could break through the Varnath's shields, but it also made one thing abundantly clear. The human body was not built to withstand the kind of force required to fire it. Ronak's injuries had been severe, trauma to his bones, internal bleeding, and nerve damage. He would recover, but the cost of the weapon was too high. The military had grown impatient. In the wake of the failure, whispers circulated about halting the project. The brass wasn't interested in a weapon that left soldiers crippled, no matter how powerful it was. But Ilara wasn't about to give up. The Varnath were still out there, their fleet approaching Earth. Humanity had no choice but to push forward. Kieran entered her office, his face drawn. "The numbers are in," he said quietly, handing her a datapad. "It's not just Ronak's. All the tests are showing the same result. The human body, even enhanced, can't handle the recoil. It's too much." Ilara looked at the numbers on the screen. The strain was catastrophic, even for the most physically fit soldiers. It wasn't just the physical injuries. The neural feedback from the railgun was overwhelming, causing permanent cognitive damage in some cases. The project, as it stood, was unsustainable. "What if we don't rely on just human strength?" Ilara muttered to herself, lost in thought. "What if we give them more? Amplify them?" Kieran looked puzzled. "Amplify?" She met his gaze, a flicker of determination igniting in her eyes. "Genetic enhancement. We push the boundaries of human physiology even further. We enhance muscle fibers, accelerate healing, increase neural efficiency. But not just modifications, full body integration. They become the weapon." The room fell silent. Kieran's face twisted in thought. "You're talking about altering soldiers, turning them into something else entirely." "That's the only way this works," Ilara said, her voice firm. "We can't afford to treat them like normal soldiers anymore. If they're going to fire this weapon, they need to become part of it. The hyperfire units." Kieran hesitated, his expression troubled. "And the cost?" Ilara looked out the window, her mind racing. "We've already crossed that line. Ronak's almost died, and we'll lose more before this is over. But if we don't do this, if we don't make them stronger, faster, more capable, the Varnath will win." The decision was made. The project would shift focus. The soldiers who volunteered for the hyperfire units would undergo genetic and physiological enhancements. They would become the weapons they wielded. The first recruit to volunteer was Lieutenant Ronax Carter. Despite the near-death experience, he came to Ilara's lab with a determination that couldn't be ignored. "I'm in," he said, his voice steady, though there was a shadow of doubt in his eyes. "If it means saving humanity, I'll do whatever it takes." Over the next several weeks, Ilara worked tirelessly with her team to design the enhancements. They would begin by altering muscle density and reinforcing bone structure to withstand the extreme pressure of firing the railgun. The neural implants would increase reaction time and allow soldiers to better control the weapon. But the risks were high. They were pushing the limits of human biology, and no one knew for sure what the long-term consequences would be. Ronax was the first test subject, undergoing a series of procedures that changed him in ways that even Ilara hadn't fully anticipated. His muscles became more defined, his reflexes almost inhumanly quick. His mind, too, was sharper, able to process the feedback from the railgun without the crushing pain that had plagued previous volunteers. But the changes weren't without side effects. Ronax's body began to crave more energy, and his temperament shifted. The enhancements made him more focused, but also more aggressive. It was as though the weapon was beginning to define who he was. The hyperfire units were born. As the first batch of soldiers underwent the transformation, Ilara watched with a mix of awe and fear. These men and women were becoming more than soldiers. They were becoming weapons of war. Each test was a gamble, each enhancement a step further down a path that couldn't be undone. But there was no turning back now. Humanity's future depended on them. The first batch of hyperfire units stood in formation in the dimly lit training chamber. their eyes sharp, their bodies honed to perfection. They were human, but no longer merely that. Each one was a testament to Ilara's groundbreaking work, a perfect fusion of flesh and technology. Their enhanced muscle fibers, fortified bones, and neural implants gave them the strength and agility to fire the railgun without succumbing to the overwhelming pressure that had crippled earlier volunteers. But what set them apart wasn't just their power, it was their will. Lieutenant Ronax Carter, now the squad leader, stood before them. His once youthful face had sharpened with the cold, steely determination that came with his enhancements. His hands, veins pulsing under the skin, rested easily on the controls of the railgun, his body perfectly attuned to its function. The others, soldiers Kayla, James, and Theo, were equally formidable, their movements swift and coordinated. They had become more than a strike force. They were living weapons. Ilara watched from the observation deck above, her heart heavy. The initial tests were promising, but she knew there was no way to predict how they would fare in combat. The hyperfire units were the last hope. If they failed, humanity's survival would become nothing more than a fading memory. She turned to Kiran, who stood beside her. His face was a mask of concern. "We're pushing them to their limits. I hope we're not making the same mistake again." Ronax's temper, his aggression, it's increasing. Ilara exhaled, her gaze unwavering. "The war is pushing us all to our limits. We don't have the luxury of time or perfect solutions anymore." Kiran didn't reply. Instead, his eyes remained fixed on the soldiers below, knowing that the weapons they'd become might be the only hope humanity had. The next day, Ilara received word that the Varnath had launched a strike force toward Earth. Their advance was swift and unrelenting, and a fleet of warships now loomed just beyond the orbit of the outer colonies. The time to test the hyperfire units had arrived. Admiral Henriksen's voice crackled through the comms as Ilara and the hyperfire units gathered in the briefing room. "Ilara, this is it. The Varnath are preparing for a full-scale assault. We need your team to breach their shields and take down their flagship. You're our only shot." Ilara nodded, though her stomach twisted. This wasn't a test anymore. The lives of everyone on Earth depended on the success of the hyperfire units. She turned to Ronax, who had assumed command of the squad. His face, though hardened, betrayed a hint of doubt. "Are you ready?" Ilara asked him, her voice steady but carrying the weight of the situation. Ronax gave a curt nod. "We're ready, Captain. We've trained for this." The team boarded the transport ships, and soon they were rocketing through space, heading straight for the heart of the Varnath fleet. The trip was filled with silence, each soldier mentally preparing for the battle that awaited. Ilara stood among them, heart pounding in her chest as she stared out the viewport at the approaching enemy. As they neared the flagship, Ilara's breath caught. The Varnath ship was a massive, dark leviathan in space, its hulking form almost swallowing the stars around it. Its shields flickered ominously, and Ilara knew that if the hyperfire units couldn't break through, they'd be reduced to dust in an instant. The command came through. Launch the assault. The hyperfire units were the first to board, their railguns mounted to their arms like extensions of their very bodies. They stormed the ship with the precision of a surgical strike, blasting through reinforced walls and barriers that would have stopped any normal soldier. But not them. With each shot, the railgun's power decimated everything in its path. Ronax led the charge, his enhanced senses allowing him to move faster than any human could. His body pulsed with energy as he fired shot after shot, each one tearing into the Varnath's defenses. The shield that had once seemed impenetrable faltered. It crackled and sparked under the force of the hyperfire unit's assault. But as the shields began to break, something unexpected happened. The Varnath retaliated with a barrage of energy blasts that rocked the ship to its core. The hyperfire units, despite their enhancements, were not invulnerable. Ronax felt the surge of energy as an explosion sent him sprawling to the ground. His vision blurred, but the neural enhancements kicked in, his brain processing the damage and sending him back on his feet. Focus. Ilara's voice came through his comm. You're breaking through. Don't stop now. Ronax clenched his fists, his body radiating power as he pushed forward. The Varnath flagship was within reach. The battle was far from over, but the tide was turning. The hyperfire units had proven their worth. They were no longer just a last-ditch hope. They were humanity's spearhead, and with every step, they carved a path to victory. The battle had escalated faster than anyone had anticipated. The hyperfire units, with their enhanced abilities and the power of the railguns at their command, tore through the Varnath defenses, but the price of victory was steep. Ronax and his team fought with the ferocity of wild animals, their bodies pushing beyond what was once thought possible. But with every shot, with every explosion, their bodies were taking a toll. Inside the Varnath flagship, Ronax's heightened senses detected the faintest tremor in the ship's structure. It was no longer just a matter of breaking through the enemy's shields. The Varnath had begun triggering self-destruct mechanisms throughout the ship, desperate to deny humanity their victory. The countdown had begun. General, the Varnath are activating the self-destruct protocol. Ilara shouted into the comm as she monitored the situation from the command ship. We need to finish this now, or the entire fleet will be wiped out. Ronax gritted his teeth. His vision was starting to blur, and his enhanced senses, once razor-sharp, felt like they were overloading. His heartbeat raced as the neural implants in his brain fought to keep up with the onslaught of data. His body screamed in protest, but there was no time to think about that. The mission came first. He turned to his team. Kayla, her face streaked with soot and sweat, was already at the main console, hacking into the Varnath system to deactivate the self-destruct. Theo was by her side, scanning the area for any additional threats. James stood at the rear, providing cover fire as they pushed forward. Each of them had changed, their personalities tempered by the enhancements they'd undergone, but their bond as soldiers remained unshaken. Ilara, we need to get to the core now. Ronax growled into his comm. His voice, though strained, was filled with resolve. If we don't stop that countdown, this whole mission is for nothing. Ilara's voice was tight with tension as she responded. You have 3 minutes, Ronax. Make it count. They stormed toward the Varnath core, a pulsating heart of cold metal and dark energy. As they reached the central chamber, the self-destruct countdown echoed in their earpieces, growing louder by the second. The air was thick with tension, the walls vibrating as the ship's imminent destruction drew closer. Suddenly, the chamber doors slammed shut with a deafening clang, sealing them in. The lights flickered as an eerie silence filled the room, broken only by the hum of the countdown. Then the enemy revealed their final card. An elite group of Varnath soldiers, armed with energy rifles and shield generators, materialized from the shadows. They had been waiting for this moment, hoping to take down the hyperfire units before they could sabotage the core. Ronax's instincts kicked in immediately. He dove to the side, firing his railgun at the incoming Varnath soldiers. The shot connected with a blinding flash, sending one of them flying across the room. Kayla followed suit, launching a salvo of energy blasts, while James and Theo flanked the enemy, taking down 2 more soldiers. But the Varnath weren't giving up without a fight. Their shields held strong against most of the hyperfire units' attacks, and they retaliated with an intensity that caught Ronax off guard. One of their energy blasts hit him square in the chest, sending him crashing to the ground with bone-shattering force. His vision swam, but his neural implant quickly adjusted, sending electrical pulses through his body to keep him conscious. The pain was excruciating, but there was no time to feel it. Focus. Ilara's voice crackled in his earpiece. You're almost there. The core's only a few meters ahead. The countdown is at 30 seconds. With a growl, Ronax pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the searing pain in his chest. His vision narrowed as he locked onto the Varnath soldiers standing between him and the core. He could feel the adrenaline surging through his veins, the enhancements pushing him to act faster than he ever could before. Every movement was calculated, precise. In a blur of motion, Ronax closed the gap. His railgun tore through the remaining Varnath soldiers, their shields cracking under the sheer force of his attacks. The core stood before him, an ominous black structure surrounded by a cage of energy. He approached it, his body screaming in protest, but he couldn't stop now. "Ronax, you have to disable it," Ilara shouted, desperation creeping into her voice. Now. Ronax barely registered the command. With one final surge of strength, he leaped toward the core, slamming his hand into the control panel and overriding the self-destruct sequence. The countdown stopped at 5 seconds. Silence. Ronax collapsed to his knees, his body trembling, the weight of the mission and the enhancements crashing down on him all at once. He was alive, but just barely. His hyperfire unit team gathered around him, their eyes filled with relief, but also a shared understanding. This victory had come at a price. As the Varnath flagship began to break apart, the hyperfire units emerged victorious. They had saved Earth, but the toll it had taken on their bodies, on their minds, was something they would carry forever. The hyperfire units stood on the bridge of their ship, gazing out at the wreckage of the Varnath flagship. Its massive form drifted in space, a hulking testament to their victory. But despite the triumph, a somber silence hung in the air. The battle had been won, but the toll on the hyperfire units was undeniable. Ronax's body was covered in cuts and bruises, and his breathing was shallow. He felt the weight of every enhancement, every modification they had made to him, pressing against him like 100 tons of steel. The pain was constant, a reminder that no matter how powerful he had become, he was still human. "Lieutenant," Kayla said, her voice quiet, "are you all right?" Ronax looked at her, his eyes weary but steady. "I will be," he replied, his voice gravelly. "We all will be. But it's going to take time." The others were in similar states. Some of them were stumbling from exhaustion, while others were already beginning to show signs of psychological strain. The enhancements they had undergone were not without consequence. The neural implants were supposed to improve their reaction times, their cognitive functions, but they were also starting to cause psychological overloads. The boundary between soldier and weapon was beginning to blur, and with each mission, the team felt less like people and more like machines. Ilara stood at the front of the room, staring out the viewport at the endless void of space. The victory was hollow. Yes, the Varnath flagship had been destroyed, and Earth had been saved, this time. But at what cost? The soldiers she had modified were no longer just soldiers. They were something else entirely. Her thoughts were interrupted by a chime on the console. It was Karan. "Ilara." Karan's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. "We need to talk. You should come to the lab." She nodded, though she didn't need to be told twice. She had seen the data coming through the terminals, the signs that the hyperfire units were beginning to break down, both physically and mentally. The modifications they had undergone had kept them alive during the mission, but now that the adrenaline had worn off, the consequences were becoming clear. When Ilara arrived in the lab, she found Kiran and several of the top medical experts standing over a table where Ronax was lying, his body hooked up to a series of machines. The monitors beeped erratically, and Ilara could see the stress his body was under. His heart rate was irregular, and his neural activity was spiking. "His body is rejecting the enhancements," one of the doctors said, his voice tense. "The more we push them, the more we break them down." He's not the only one. We're seeing similar signs in the others. Ilara's heart sank. She had known there would be consequences, but seeing it laid out in front of her was a bitter pill to swallow. These soldiers, these heroes, were breaking. They had given everything to save humanity, and now it seemed the very thing that had made them capable of such feats was destroying them from the inside out. "I didn't ask for this," Kiran said, his voice tinged with frustration. "We didn't sign up for this. Ilara, you've gone too far. We're turning our soldiers into something monstrous." Ilara's throat tightened. She had known the risks when she initiated the project, but seeing Ronax lying there, barely holding on, made her question everything. Had she been too focused on the end goal? Had she lost sight of what made these soldiers human in the first place? "They were our last hope," she replied, her voice strained. "The Varnath were on the verge of wiping us out. We didn't have a choice." Kiran shook his head. "There's always a choice. We're playing God with their lives, Ilara. And now, they're paying for it." Ronax's eyes fluttered open, and he looked up at Ilara. His voice was weak, but the determination in his gaze hadn't faltered. "Captain, we knew the risks. We volunteered. Don't let this be for nothing." Ilara clenched her fists, the weight of his words settling over her like a storm. She had created these soldiers, but in doing so, she had also created their suffering. Was the price of victory worth the lives it cost? And what about the future? How many more would she be willing to sacrifice to keep humanity safe? "I'll find a way to fix this," Ilara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I promise." But deep down, she wasn't sure if there was a way to undo the damage. The hyperfire units were more than just enhanced soldiers now. They were broken, and the path forward was uncertain. As the days passed, Ilara worked tirelessly in the lab, searching for a way to reverse or mitigate the effects of the enhancements. She had pushed the boundaries of human biology too far, and now the very thing that had made them unstoppable was threatening to tear them apart. The question was no longer whether they could win the war, but whether they could survive it. The answer, Ilara knew, was complicated. Victory had come at a cost, and she wasn't sure what price humanity would have to pay next. Days had passed since the aftermath of the Varnath strike, and the hyperfire units were barely holding on. Ronax, Kayla, James, and Theo had each endured the toll of their enhancements. Their bodies and minds were fraying, the artificial boundaries between soldier and human no longer clear. Ilara had pored over data endlessly, seeking the solution, but the truth was becoming increasingly undeniable. They were running out of time. Ilara paced through the sterile halls of the lab, her eyes weary. The lab had once been a place of progress, of hope. Now it felt like a prison of her own making. She had given everything to save humanity, and in doing so, had condemned the very soldiers who made it possible. She could still see the desperate look in Ronax's eyes as he had fought to keep himself together, even as his body rejected the enhancements. She stopped in front of a window that overlooked the training bay. Inside, the hyperfire units were sparring, though their movements were slower, more labored. Their bodies were beginning to break down, and they had become more distant from each other, isolated by the pain and the psychological strain of what they had become. They were soldiers who could no longer fight the war they were bred for, their lives now defined by the very enhancements that had once made them heroes. Kiran entered the room, his face grim. "We're out of options, Ilara. There's no cure. There's no way to reverse what you've done to them." Ilara's chest tightened. The weight of his words was a bitter truth. "I'm not giving up on them," she whispered. She wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. She couldn't face the reality that her creations, her soldiers, would be lost to a war they couldn't win, not physically, and certainly not mentally. Kiran's expression softened. "You've done everything you can. But now, the real question is, what will we do next? You can't keep pushing them like this, and we can't go back to a normal fight. There's something else now." Ilara closed her eyes, the storm of guilt and uncertainty raging inside her. The war had left her with no easy answers, only impossible choices. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing against her chest. The comms suddenly crackled, interrupting her thoughts. It was the fleet commander. "Ilara, we've received new intelligence. The Varnath have regrouped. They're preparing to launch a final assault on Earth. This time, they're bringing their entire armada." Her breath caught. The Varnath were back, and they were coming in full force. But this time, humanity had no more hyperfire units to rely on, no more near-invincible soldiers to stand between Earth and annihilation. "We can't lose them," Ilara said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "We need to give them one more chance." Kiran shook his head. "You're asking them to fight again, Ilara. You saw what they've become. They can't do it." She turned to face him, her eyes filled with an unwavering resolve. "I'll do whatever it takes to give them a chance to fight. They deserve that, don't they?" Kiran's silence hung in the air for a long moment before he finally spoke. "And what about you, Ilara? What will you sacrifice this time? Are you willing to lose yourself as well?" The question hung heavily, and Ilara felt its weight settle deep within her. She had already given so much of herself, her career, her convictions, her morality, all for the sake of humanity. She had pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable in the name of survival. But now, the question wasn't just about humanity's survival, it was about her own soul. "Ilara, you don't have to do this," Kiran said quietly. "You don't have to destroy yourself over this." But she could already feel the answer, clear as day. She couldn't let go. The hyperfire units were her responsibility, and she would face whatever consequences came with that responsibility. They had been her creation, and in a way, they had become her family. "I won't give up on them," Ilara said, her voice firm. "They have one last chance, and I won't fail them now." Kiran sighed, his expression weary but understanding. "Then we'll help you. But whatever happens next, Ilara, you have to know, you can't keep sacrificing them like this. There has to be a way to stop the cycle." Ilara nodded, though she wasn't sure if she believed it. She would fight for their future, for the future of humanity, but there was no denying the price that had already been paid. As the fleet prepared to face the Varnath's final assault, Ilara stood before the hyperfire units one last time. The battle was coming, and this time, she knew there would be no second chances. Ronax, Kayla, James, and Theo, her soldiers, her warriors, stood tall, their faces resolute despite the burden they carried. They had been changed forever, but they were ready. "You've already done more than anyone could ask of you," Ilara said, her voice shaking with emotion. "But I'm asking you to fight one more time. For us. For everything we fought for." Ronax's gaze met hers, and in that moment, Ilara saw the warrior he had become. Broken, yes, but unyielding. "We fight for Earth, Captain," he said, his voice steady. "And for each other." And so they prepared. The hyperfire units, once humanity's final hope, now stood as the last line of defense against the Varnath. The cost of victory had been high, and the war was far from over, but there was one truth they all shared: the fight was worth it, and they would face whatever came next together.